I like feral bees. The reason I like feral bees is because I've had a lot of issues with the standard Italian bees and their genetics. They're not able to deal with the varroa mites on their own, and I realize that I don't want to treat the bees for varroa destructor mite, and so I've had a lot of issues dealing with that. And so going to an approach where I'm trying to be treatment free is not the easiest thing to do because a lot of bees are going to die, a lot of colonies are going to die until the genes that can handle it remain, and the losses can be tremendous. And so what I found is that with feral bees, they're already able to handle uh, the varroa mites in nature and other issues, drought, cold, heat, all the different things that we deal with, that the bees deal with in nature, um, has naturally selected for genes that can handle it. So they're very low intervention or no intervention, and that's what's very appealing to me. That's what I want to do. So what I'm not talking about is keeping very aggressive bees. The bees that I have, especially the colony on this side of the Long Langstroth, uh, those bees are a little bit spicy, not overly spicy, but they get stirred up a little bit more easily when I'm working the colony, but they're not attacking me in mass. Um, it's not been a problem. And uh, what I don't want to do is to keep Africanized bees or bees that have a lot of Africanized genes where they're being extremely aggressive or even past a very minimal threshold. That top 80-90% of that aggressive gene, if that's expressed in the bees, I don't want that. So that's not what I'm saying. Uh, but that being said, there are some Africanized genes in the gene pool in our area in general in Texas, and uh, so like for example, I think even bee weaver, they have some Africanized genetics in there, but because there's a little bit in there, it's actually been diluted across the spectrum more uh, over the last, say, couple decades, to where there's not nearly as many fully Africanized bee colonies out in nature anymore in our area. There are some for sure, and I'm definitely not advocating even keeping those or letting those even live. If you find uh, an Africanized colony that's obviously fully expressing that gene or even largely expressing that aggressive gene, uh, those bees should really be euthanized uh, because they're just extremely dangerous. But what happens when those bees, even Africanized bees, uh, they mate with non-Africanized genes? Uh, those genes are cut in half every time that they're mated with non-Africanized genes, or bees that have Africanized non-Africanized genes. Say Africanized genes with Italian genes, that trait may still be passed on. Those genes may be a dominant trait that's passed on. But a lot of times, what's happening is those genes are diluted, and so a lot of the wild colonies, the feral colonies in our area, do not have that extremely aggressive trait, even though they have some Africanized genetics in them. If that makes sense. So going back to hundreds of years ago, there were no honeybees native to the Americas. They were brought over by Europeans. And so those bees were feral back then before Africanized genetics got into the country, got into the United States and the rest of the Americas. And there weren't the varroa mites, and they weren't a problem because they weren't here. So when those bees were out in nature, they were being their gene pool was being weeded out by nature to suit whatever area that those bees were in. And so I have a book from that talks about in the 1800s finding feral bees and harvesting honey Uh, and we know that those bees have been in the Americas for a long time. But what's happened is that as the new genes come into the country, in both North and South America, also those genes are being uh, they're they're being combined with other genes. So we're getting other genetics that are helping the bees in some ways, maybe hurting the bees in other ways, or not being real conducive to beekeeping in other ways. And so those genes are being recombined even now to this day. Um, and the bees that are able to handle the adverse situations and issues that come up, those bees are able to make it out in the wild, and they're the genetics that aren't are continuing to be weeded out in nature. And so what I realized was that when I wasn't actually willing to treat my bees for varroa mites, that I'd lose those colonies because they weren't those genes hadn't been weeded out. The genes that couldn't handle varroa mites weren't weeded out. And so I've come to the point where I like feral bees, but there are downsides to feral bees too. Maybe they're not great honey producers. Maybe they are a little bit spicy, or a lot spicy. If they are a lot spicy, then I don't want even those bees. Maybe uh, they're not able to, or they don't care to make a lot of honey. Um, it's just not in their genes. They don't need to. They're just focused on surviving and reproducing. So in those cases, then they're not a whole lot of benefit to me because I do want those products from the bees. But my first goal is just to have bees that didn't die on their own. So that's really my first goal. Secondly, and which actually will supersede my first goal, is I don't want to have genes that are too hot. I don't want to have too hot of bees. So if they're too hot, then it doesn't matter if they're able to survive. I don't want those bees. So those two things are my first two things. But then after that, then I want bees that are able to thrive in our area, that are going to be able to produce honey, that are going to be more gentle, um, all those things. And so I've started looking at the varroa sensitive hygiene genetic trait, and it's a set of genes that helps the bees to basically, they know to smell for the varroa mites in the brood, and so they'll actually remove those baby bees that have the varroa mites in the when they're in the brood state still, and they'll get them out of the hive. They'll get them out of the colony, and so they're actually reducing that mite load that way. So those are not feral bees necessarily, and you can buy those traits in. That accomplishes one of the main things that I'm looking at in having feral bees. If I have a low honey production set of hives, but they're able to survive, then maybe I need to add in, some Italian VSH bees or something. And so I'm looking at how to have good genes however I get to that point where I'm happy with where my bees are. So that's kind of where I'm at. And for me, that's been a big answer on how to keep bees in a way that I'm comfortable with, where I don't treat the bees, and they're not dying out, all those things. That's what I'm looking for. So how do we get those genes into our apiaries that we want? Maybe you do want to treat, and your focus is different. What are the answers for keeping the genes that are doing the things that you want in the bees? Another thing that's interesting and food for thought is the bees that we have in our apiaries are breeding with feral bees, and then our bees are breeding back to those bees as well a lot of times. And so when we're having genes that we like and we're continuing to build our numbers of colonies up, then we're in some way able to um, basically disproportionately impact the overall genetics of the bees in our overall area. And so, how do we push our genetics out into the feral bees, maybe improve those bees, and then we're having a symbiotic sort of natural breeding program, basically, where we're getting the genes that we want um, on both sides. And so maybe those bees out in nature now, they're getting some souped up, uh, honey producing genes into those. We're getting those into those feral colonies maybe uh, to some extent, and then the ones that can't make it are weeded out again, and the ones that can, maybe now they have a little bit of a better honey production in the wild. So just thinking about our apiaries, how we're interacting with how our apiaries, our bees are interacting with feral bees, and the overall genetic uh, pool that we're having in our bees. That stuff is important, and I think it goes beyond just I'm just going to have this kind of bee or I'm just going to have this kind of bee. How do we look at the overall gene pool?